Well, I'll introduce myself and then I'll explain how we're going to conduct the seminar or the workshop. So I was born in India. My parents were missionaries, and then I was brought up in Scotland. And just in case anybody doesn't know that, Scotland is a different nation than England. Quite a big difference actually in the culture and in the outlook of the people. In my mid-teens we moved to England, and in my late teens, early 20s I trained for the ministry. And in my particular denomination they gave us an interview before we finished, and they would send you to a place. You didn't have a choice, you went to a particular place. And in the interview I said that the only thing I don't know anything about is the inner city. Well, that's where my first church was. And it was a situation in the middle of Birmingham which was a replant. In other words, it was an old church. It had been there for more than 100 years, and the task was to plant the church into that neighborhood, because nobody that attended the church actually lived in that neighborhood. So how to plant the church into that neighborhood, and that was a particular challenge because the neighborhood was very multicultural, and the church membership, the church attendance, was not multicultural. It was monocultural in ways that I'll explain a bit more about as we go. So from that church I planted another church together with my wife. That's not particularly a multicultural church. We have a few other cultures in the church, but what I have done is work closely with people of other cultures to help them plant churches. Particularly in recent times, the last 16 years, I've been the leader of a Bible college, a theological college, and we have 22 different nations in the college, 50% of whom were not born in the UK, but they live in the UK. And many of them are trying to plant multicultural churches. So it's a subject which is of great interest to me. Recently I wrote a book together with a friend of mine, which is called Practices for the Refounding of God's People. And I'm drawing your attention to this book particularly because there's a whole chapter in this book which deals specifically with the issue of those who've coming to Europe from other continents and the part that they can play in creating a multicultural church. So you might want to have a look at that at the conclusion of the session. We're going to deal with what is really a big topic, and therefore inevitably we'll be just raising issues, and we can't cover every single issue that's related to this topic. But hopefully we'll raise enough issues that we can get into the topic in a variety of ways, and there may be things that you would like to zone in on, and we can deal with that if you would like to. Now, assimilation is what the United States used to think they were doing when they accepted people from many different nations. That is to say, they thought that they would leave their cultures at the border post and they would just become Americans. They would leave behind their language, they would leave behind their culture, they would leave behind anything from the old country, and they would be Americans. And they used to call that the melting pot. In other words, nothing distinctive would remain. You would take on a new culture. Now, of course, what Americans discovered is that actually it doesn't really work like that. And people actually hold on to their culture for a lot longer than people might imagine. And what's happened in the United States today is that we don't have assimilation. And to a certain degree, some of the conflict that we see in America today is caused by the fact that actually that assimilation is not going on. And to a certain extent, there is what we might call culture wars, as people's cultures collide with one another. So that's one definition. Or one term that we need to be aware of. The second term, which is where again the United States used to find themselves, but again arguably they don't find themselves there now, is the term cross-cultural. Now cross-cultural is where there clearly is a dominant culture, and the dominant culture can cope with other cultures provided that the other cultures give deference to the dominant culture. So that's a situation where we're not expecting the main culture to change, but there's a recognition that there are other cultures around. So that's cross-cultural. And then we sometimes talk about multicultural. And multicultural is where you have many cultures existing side by side. There's not necessarily a dominant culture. There's not necessarily one culture that everybody has to adopt, but rather the dominant culture that used to be there makes accommodation to the other cultures that have arrived. And arguably, that's where we are in many countries in the West at the moment, where the once dominant culture is having to ask itself, how do we live with all these other cultures? And there's a particular challenge, as you're probably aware, from Islam, which is not a culture that likes to easily coexist with other cultures, and in fact, in many cases, would prefer to be the dominant culture itself, and that produces all kinds of tensions. And then there is intercultural. And intercultural situations is where there's an attempt not to preserve cultures side by side. It's different than the melting pot. It's where all of the cultures that come together bring their own unique contribution, but together they try and learn something from one another and coexist in such a way that to a certain extent they create a new culture that hasn't existed before. And in many of the situations in which we find ourselves, that's at least what some congregations are aspiring to. How do we create a new culture which is not actually strictly any of the cultures that we're bringing, but we discover that in Christ there's a new kind of culture emerging. So there's a whole variety of terms that we just need to keep in mind when we're thinking about this subject. So, what do we mean by multicultural church planting? Well, let's kind of go back to the beginning and recognize that quite early on in the Christian experience, the church began to encounter what we might call cross-cultural church planting. And that happened when we made the move as a Christian community from being Jesus synagogues to situations where Gentiles began to join the church in significant numbers. And as far as the scripture is concerned, we see that first being explored in the city of Antioch, where Paul had a problem. He wanted to take the gospel to the Gentiles, but probably hadn't thought through all of the issues that might arise in such a situation. And the first issue that arose was this question: okay, we are Gentiles, we want to become Christians. The term Christian wasn't then used. They were followers of the way. But does it mean we have to become Jews in order to become Christian? Now, it's a curious question, that, because we would obviously answer that question quite easily because of the history of 2,000 years, and we would say, oh, no, of course, you don't have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. But that was not so obvious to the early church. And actually, many in the early church would have said, of course you have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian, because you can't understand the significance of the Jewish Messiah, apart from the Old Testament, which are Jewish scriptures. The followers of Jesus were all Jews. The first disciples were all Jews. Jesus was a Jew. We worship on a Saturday. We have synagogue practice, which is really what the first churches essentially were. Those of us who live in Jerusalem worship at the temple. Yes, we are Jews. Of course you have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. But then, as you know, that issue was debated at the Council of Jerusalem, and they began to realize that actually, if that was true, then Jesus' death on the cross was not sufficient for salvation. If you also had to take on all kinds of other cultural and religious practices, apart from simply believing that Jesus had died for us on the cross. And so eventually they came to the conclusion, well, actually, you can become a Christian and bring your culture with you. And it's amazing insight. In fact, Christianity is almost unique amongst all the religions of the world, because actually, if you think about Islam, for example, really, that doesn't apply to Islam. Because actually, if you really push it, in becoming a Muslim, you're really becoming an Arab. You're taking on Arab culture. Christianity is pretty unique in being able to say, no, you can bring your culture with you. Now, the gospel has to judge all cultures, but it can also affirm all cultures. So that's a very unique conclusion, and it kind of sets the tone quite early on in the life of the church to what we might be talking about. So multicultural church planting is what we're beginning to explore, and for us that means initially a situation where people are coming into the church, but we're not necessarily in this first stage at a situation of intercultural worship or intercultural church planting. In the first place, we're recognizing that there can be situations where people of different cultures operate side by side, living within their own culture. But there's a limit to how long that situation can remain. And eventually there comes the challenge, how do we move from multicultural church planting to intercultural church planting? Now we'll explore that a bit more later on in the talk. So we've said that the gospel takes culture seriously. But as a matter of fact, that's something that Christian missions have sometimes struggled with. So the first time in recent history that was an issue was in the work of somebody called Donna McGavran, who wrote an amazing book way back in the 1950s called The Bridges of God. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about McGavran. He was born in India. His parents were missionaries, and he grew up on the mission field and then later became a missionary. I want you to just imagine his situation. He was in a mission context where American missionaries actually had put in huge amounts of money. They built schools, they built hospitals, they had medical facilities, they had a fantastic investment in the life of the community in which they were located. But they saw very few converts. Now, let's just think about this for a moment. If you were a missionary in that situation and you were reporting back to headquarters and you saw very few converts, what would your report say? Now, McGavran thought, well, yeah, that's a reasonable explanation. That's the explanation of my parents. That's what I see. So I'll accept that explanation. But then one day there came a problem. In the neighboring state of Orissa, tens of thousands of Indians almost overnight became Christians. That's not supposed to happen. What? It's British Baptists doing this. They must be doing something wrong. What are they doing? Are they twisting the gospel, or what's happening? Why are all these people becoming Christians? Especially since they're very poorly funded, because the British Baptists don't like to pay their missionaries too much. Now, McGavran went to Orissa and he made a very interesting observation. He realized that these Indians were becoming Christians and were not leaving their culture behind. It was as simple as that. Actually, he began to see that in his own mission context, what had been happening is that really they weren't just preaching the gospel. They were asking people to become Europeans. They were asking people to become Americans. But not just Europeans and Americans, if you like, second-class Europeans and Americans, because you could never really be a European or an American. In other words, they were asking them to leave their culture at the mission door and take on another culture as well as taking on the gospel. And McGavran realized that this was actually a dreadful thing, that it actually countermanded the gospel itself, and he began to ask the question, not just of that situation in India, but of situations around the world. How can missions operate in such a way that they don't ask people to abandon their culture? How can people bring their culture with them as part of their expression of the faith? So that was a very important moment, and McGavran went on to found a school of missions at Fuller in California, and many people have been influenced by him. And one of the things that he advocated was something called the homogeneous unit principle. It's a controversial principle, but basically what it says is this, that actually it's possible to plant churches that are, if you like, designed for the people of a particular culture. The homogeneous unit principle. It's not multicultural, it's single, it's monocultural, but it actually takes seriously the nature of the culture that you're trying to reach and sees much more growth as a consequence. Well, controversial. But nevertheless, as people began to practice this principle, they discovered, well, yes, we're getting much better results in terms of conversions when we adopt this principle. Now, if we are going to do multicultural church planting, what in fact we're talking about is heterogeneous churches. Heterogeneous meaning more than one culture in the church. So how do we cope with that? How do we work with the idea that on one hand, we win more people if we're homogeneous, but on the other hand, actually, as we look at the church in the New Testament, we see that many cultures were in the church. How do we cope with that tension? Let me take you back to the church that I was telling you about, my first church in inner city Birmingham. After several years, we had 10 nations in the church. 40% were Afro-Caribbean peoples, 15% were different Asian peoples, and the rest were different kinds of British people. And there were many kinds of British people in the church, all of whom had their own quite distinct cultures. Now, we were very pleased with that. I was extremely pleased with it. And I used to even think that part of the reason for our success, and we were numerically quite successful, part of the reason for our success was precisely that we were heterogeneous. Because it was the only place in our community where cultures of different kinds actually met, actually encountered each other. There was no other social location in which people of different cultures ever met one another. The church was the only place. So we were pleased with that. And then I ran into this idea of the homogeneous unit principle. And I began to wonder, what's actually going on here? And then I made a discovery, and it was simply this. When I asked the question, how did the people in our church come to faith, I realized that every single person had come to faith through somebody of their own culture. In other words, what was actually going on was at the beginning of people's spiritual encounter, we were operating homogeneously. But as they developed in terms of their Christian walk, we were operating heterogeneously. Getting the balance between homogeneous and heterogeneous is actually quite a skill, but it's actually quite important if we're going to operate effectively as multicultural church planters. Now let's just stop and think about that. Is that just racism in disguised form? Let's just think about that for a minute. And let me ask you this question. If you find yourself in a strange city and you're lost and you need to ask for help, who do you ask for help? What do you think? Who would you ask for help?
Similar people, that means my own nation, or at least Europeans in Asia or whatever.
Yeah, that's kind of what we do, isn't it? And it's not something we think about, it's just what we do. I'm an older man. I'm probably going to ask another older man of, maybe a similar appearance in terms of race or background. I'm probably going to ask them. I'm probably not going to ask a young Muslim woman for directions. Probably not. No reason why I shouldn't, but I'm probably not. In other words, if we're not Christians and we're going to make a new discovery, if you like, we're going to approach the people who are most like us, because those are the people we tend to trust. It's not complicated. That's just the way in which we operate. So if we're asking people to become a Christian, the most important decision they might ever have to make in their lives, they're probably going to respond more easily through somebody who is like them. I've got a good friend who is an Ethiopian, and he's planted 7 churches in Britain. He's also planted churches in Norway and Istanbul and various other places. And I said to him, when you first came to Britain, how did you start your first church? Oh, he said, it's simple. I went to the bus station. I've never heard of bus stations in evangelism before. What was he doing at the bus station? He said, I discovered that Ethiopians traveled by bus. And so I stood at the bus station, and every time I recognized an Ethiopian, I would say to them, can I help you? Is there anything that you need help with as you're arriving in this new city? He built his church very quickly like that. Because the people who were coming in, they heard their language, Amharic, from somebody that looked like an Ethiopian, because he was an Ethiopian, and immediately they trusted this man. And so he was able to build a bond of friendship. So actually, it's not necessarily racist. It is simply a very practical way of going about things. And we'll come back to that in a few moments. So if we're going to plant a multicultural church, we also need to be very clear as to why we want to do that, because actually it is harder than planting a monocultural church. So we just need to be clear. Why do we want to do this? Now, we may have very, very good reasons for wanting to do that, but we need to know why we want to do it. Okay, let's move on. So I want to think about migrant churches, first of all, because migrant churches in Europe are, of course, monocultural. They tend to be composed of only one cultural group. Now, Most migrant churches will tell you we have an intention to reach the host population, but mostly they don't. And there are good reasons why they don't, and we'll come back to some of those reasons in a little while. When migrant churches first develop, there tend to be 4 stages of development. And the first stage is, like my friend in Leeds at the bus station, migrants have many, many needs. And the first need, how do we survive? And how do we retain some sense of identity in this new context? So the very first function of a migrant church is to help their members with survival and identity. It's an important contribution to make to those who are coming into a new city for the first time. As that develops, their attention begins to turn to the needs of that community, and they begin to serve that community. And that community has many, many needs. They need help with very practical problems. How do I get a job? How do I make sure that my immigration papers are in order? How do I deal with the police? How do I deal with housing? How do I deal with sometimes food? There are practical needs, and the attention of the migrant church is focused on those kinds of needs. The third thing that happens is that once they're well established, they began to feel compassion for those in the homeland. So, for example, one of my good friends is pastor of a Zimbabwean church in Leicester. It's a great church, by the way, it's a great church. They're very keen to reach English people. So far, they haven't done that. And there are a number of reasons why that's the case, but they really have an intention to do that. One of the things my friend does is he spends a lot of time in Zimbabwe because their church has a passion for helping the folks back home. And you'll find that most migrant churches engage in some kind of mission activity in the countries from which they came. Only much later do they think about the wider context in which they're located. How do we begin to reach the host community? My friend that I was just telling you about, Leonard, his name is, he has a little song which he sings, leads the congregation in this song at the end of every service. And he says, I'm not going to sing you the song, you wouldn't like that. But the song goes like this. He says, Leicester is our territory. This is our home. Move over, Satan. This is our home. I love that. Actually, I grew up in Leicester in my late teens, and first time I heard that, I cried. I just loved the thought that God had sent all these missionaries from Zimbabwe to help us with the mission field in Leicester. Leicester is our territory. This is our home. That moved me. I love that. Now, are they going to be successful in reaching the people of Leicester? Yeah, they probably are, actually. And it's already started in a very slow way. And these are some of the ways it starts. They're beginning to marry local people. That's the first thing that starts to happen. They begin to witness to their colleagues at work. Now, the next thing that happens is this. They begin to realize, many of them are doctors and lawyers, and they've got a lot of white colleagues, but they begin to realize, actually, their white colleagues probably wouldn't be comfortable with Zimbabwe-style worship. And so they've begun to ask the question, how can we make some adjustments to our Zimbabwe-style worship so that it would be possible to invite our white, professional, middle-class colleagues into this context? Well, it's a good question to ask. But those are the sorts of questions that occur, but they don't occur until those congregations are quite well developed. What begins to happen with the migrant churches is that the second generation, in other words, the children of those who've been there for a while, and the grandchildren of those who've been for a while, actually they begin to think about church planting amongst the host community, amongst the community that they are now living amongst, because they've got many friends amongst those people. And I'm hearing more and more stories of the children and the grandchildren of migrants beginning to say, we want to plant a church, but we want to plant a church for our English friends. Now that's a fairly new development, but it's an exciting one, because they stand a great chance of being able to win English people because they've got English accents or German accents or whatever it might be. They know the indigenous language extremely well. They know the culture extremely well. They haven't lost their passion for the gospel, and they've got the ability then to create something that their parents couldn't do. However, what do you think the reaction of the migrant churches might be to their children doing such a thing?
They're not interested.
They're scared. We're going to lose our young people. And very often, there's actually quite a strong reaction to that development. So one of the things that we have to do is work with the existing migrant churches to say, look, this is something of God. It's not something you need to be afraid of. But they recognize themselves that actually it is potentially a threat to their long-term existence, at least their long-term existence in the form that they've known. But, of course, if they don't do it, if they don't make that development, they've got no future anyway. So it's actually quite a helpful thing. But the problem in all of that is that actually there are very few training environments that make that possible, because there are unique circumstances that relate to that kind of church planting. And actually creating the right kind of training environments is actually quite difficult to do. So it's something that we need to pay attention to. Okay, so when we engage in multicultural church planting, or indeed, actually, to be truthful, in any kind of church planting, one of the core principles is that we allow the context to shape the church rather than the church to shape the mission. So let me actually rephrase that. It's the mission itself, in other words, the context that we're going to, the people group that we're going to, needs to play a part in shaping what this church is going to look like. Now, I say it that way because what often happens is that when we engage in mission, we have a tendency to have a preformed idea of what the church is going to look like, which actually doesn't relate to the mission itself. Some people call it, using an American phrase, the cookie cutter church. Just like every time you press the cookie cutter, it looks the same. Well, actually, that's not helpful when we're dealing with these multicultural issues. We need to be open to the possibility that the church that is planted is going to look quite different than any experience of church we've known ourselves. That's a challenge for us, because it can be a bit scary if we allow the context, the mission itself, to begin to shape the church, but actually it's quite an important principle. I love the story of Paul accepting the call to Macedonia. Come over and help us, says the man from Macedonia. In other words, there's going to be a partnership here which is going to be a little bit different than anything Paul has known before. And it really was different. You know, when he went to Macedonia, I wonder if you've ever asked yourself the question, did Paul ever meet the man from Macedonia that appeared in his vision? Actually, he didn't, as far as we know. He met Lydia, and he met a jailer, and he met a demon-possessed slave girl. And these are the people that he started the church with. Probably wasn't what was in his mind when he was thinking about the call from this man in his dream. It wasn't a man, it was a woman. It wasn't any woman, it was a woman who was very wealthy. It wasn't an ordinary person that was part of this church, it was somebody who was demon possessed. Whoa. This is very strange material to begin your church planting efforts in Europe. Okay, so the first task then, when we're going to begin with the mission, is to spend time listening. Spend time listening. What are we listening for? Well, we're asking the question, what is God already doing? What is God doing? And how can we cooperate with that? I've got a friend who was employed by the Church of Scotland, very imaginative exercise. He was employed by the Church of Scotland in a particular part of Scotland where they had 3 parish churches that historically had been very successful, but now they were down to about 12 old ladies in each of these 3 churches, so maybe 36 people in all. And he was given the task of starting a new church. And the Church of Scotland said to him, your first task for the first year is to do nothing except listen. Don't do anything, don't do any mission, just listen. He discovered he wasn't very good at listening, but fortunately his wife was. And so he listened through his wife. And what happened in year 2 was they began to do something that he would never have thought of. And he began to call people who had had spiritual questions, spiritual issues, into encounter meetings. Now, normally he would never have done that. Normally he would have just started a church service. That's what evangelists do, isn't it? They start a church service. But it wasn't a church service he started with. 2 or 3 years later, the group that is part of this encounter is composed of young people, young marrieds in particular, and they far outnumber the total number of people in the 3 parish churches around. Now that's a problem for those parish churches, because you can imagine the question that comes from the parish churches is, when are these people going to become proper Christians? When are they going to come and join the parish church? Well, the answer is probably never. Because actually what they've created can't fit into the existing notion of what church is. But actually, it's a thriving, successful church that they're now beginning to replicate in other areas in that part of Scotland. It's the mission that needs to form the church, and we don't know what that's going to look like unless we start to listen and ask the question, what is God up to? And what God was up to in this particular case was he was causing particularly younger people to ask some pretty important questions about life. What is life all about? Isn't there something more than simply the consumer culture? How do we find our sense of meaning? How do we find our sense of identity? The next thing that we do in this process of listening is, as part of the listening exercise, we're looking for the people of peace. Now, I won't take a long time about this, because you've probably heard about the people of peace as a concept many, many times, but basically we're talking about people who are the gatekeepers to given communities. Who are the people that others trust? Who are the people who are influential? Can we come alongside them? I've got a friend in India who told me he was planting churches, and I said, oh, that's interesting. He told me that God had called him to the least evangelized state in India, and to the part of that least evangelized state that was least evangelized. So he was going to the most difficult part of India. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What's your method? He said, it's simple. I train people to go into villages where there is no church, and their instruction is to walk around the village every day praying until eventually somebody will say to them, what are you doing? That's the home in which the church is going to be established, because that's the person of peace. I said, what? That is completely crazy. Why would you do that? He said, well, it may be crazy, but I've planted 450 churches that way. Right, I'm going to take this concept of the person of peace a bit more seriously. And do you know what? I made a discovery then. Do you remember I said to you that my first church started to grow? Well, let me tell you how it started to grow. I was so desperate because, I'd done 4 years of university education, theology, and then I discovered on the streets of Birmingham that I knew nothing much that was of much help. I loved the study, by the way, but it just wasn't helping me on the streets of Birmingham. Funnily enough, the working class people in that area were not interested in church history and hermeneutics and all the other things I'd learned. And so in desperation, this is what I did. I don't recommend it, by the way, but this is what I did. I went door to door and I said to people, I'm from such and such a church. Is there anybody here that would like to join a home Bible study to learn about Jesus? In the first 100 homes, 20 people said yes, 12 actually came, and 6 got saved. We had our first breakthrough. Now, I just thought that's because I was really clever at the time. But looking back on it, after I heard about the people of peace, I realized that the first home that we called on, the woman in question said, if you're going to have such a study, you must have it in my home. And that was significant because every other home we went to, they said, where is this study going to be held? And I said, it's going to be held in Rosie's house. Oh, if it's Rose, we'll come. Wow. Because she was the street mother. She was the person of peace for that street. It's amazing. I didn't realize that I'd stumbled across something. Now, it didn't work in any other street because we hadn't found the people of peace. But it worked in that street. And that gave us our first breakthrough in terms of the people of that neighborhood. So find the people of peace. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky one. Start small, because sometimes I say to people when they're church planting, don't start small, because that can be a problem. But when it comes to either cross-cultural or multicultural church planting, you have to be a little bit careful, because the first group you start with is going to determine what the church is going to look like for a very long time to come. And what often happens with cross-cultural church planting, let's talk about that first of all. For example, a lot of middle-class churches in England try and plant churches in working-class areas because there's a huge need. But what they do is they go in with lots of middle-class people, and then they discover that working-class people won't come to that meeting. They won't come to that church, because you've preformed the culture that's completely alien to the culture you're trying to reach. So in that situation, it's far better to start with winning people on the estate, even if it means starting a lot smaller. I'll give you an example of that. I used to preach in a church in Chester, and it was a church that was on a main road, and one side of the main road was a very wealthy area, and on the other side of the road was a very poor area. And most of the people, in fact all of the people that came to the church, were from the wealthy side. And I said to them one day, why does nobody come to church from that poorer area? Oh, they said they're not receptive to the gospel. I said, okay. A few months later I came back and I said, oh, I see that I've got another church using your building in the evening. Yes, they said. It's a funny thing that's happened. They're all the people from the poor area. I said, well, how did that happen? They said, well, one woman became a Christian and she started a church in her home. And suddenly, dozens and dozens of people from the estate became Christians. And then they ran out of space, so they asked if they could rent our building, and we've agreed to them renting the building. I thought you said they were not receptive to the gospel. Well, they said, it's not really a proper church. I said, what do you mean it's not a proper church? They said, well, they don't have a proper start time. And when they first come, all they do is drink coffee and talk to one another. Sometimes they even bring their food and they have a meal together. And it's ages before they ever get round to any kind of worship. And it's not really the kind of worship that we would appreciate. I could see why they'd never won people from that estate to their church. We need to sometimes start small to make sure that we don't predetermine the culture before we get going. Okay, even though we start small, we need a team. So how do we build the team? Well, first of all, team is not just about people with gifts, it's about people that you can trust. People you can trust. Actually, the relationship that takes place in the team is going to mark what happens in the church, because the team is the church before the church begins. So that what you do in terms of building a relationship is actually very, very important. Second of all, part of building trust is permitting conflict. Conflict is not necessarily bad. What makes conflict bad is how you handle it. But actually, conflict can sometimes be a helpful thing, because actually, if you can survive conflict and deal with it well, that's how you build deep relationships. So you have to permit conflict in the team. Thirdly, the team does have to agree about purpose, vision, and values. Now, there's not time to explore that, but I think you probably understand about purpose, vision, and values. I will just mention the third one of these. Many times teams agree on purpose and vision, but they don't talk about values, because they think that purpose and vision is all you need. But values are the 90% of the iceberg that's below the surface. That is what will sink your ship if you're not careful. What are values about? Values are about the things that really matter to us. The things that really matter to us. I told you about my first church, and we saw a lot of growth, and we used to have a lot of arguments amongst the leadership. And I was puzzled by this because we were so successful. We were seeing growth, we were achieving our purpose, we were achieving our vision. Why were we arguing? Because we never agreed on our values. We'd never talked about them. What really matters to me about this church is, and we eventually discovered that actually what really matters to us about that church were quite different under the surface, and we had to take time to tease those things out. Now, if you do succeed in building a multicultural church, that is to say a situation where different cultures operate in the same location, actually that can't last forever. At some stage you have to face the issue, how do we move from multicultural to intercultural? It might last for quite a while, but it can't last forever. And I'll just give you a little example of that. I know a very good church in London. It's actually an Ealing Pentecostal church, and it's an amazing church. It's about 2,500 people strong, and they've got maybe 20 different nations there, and they very thoughtfully appointed pastors for the different national groups to take care of them, and it works really well. But it's not going to last forever. Because actually what's happening over time is that the different cultural groups are not meeting each other. Mm-hmm. They're present together in the main worship group, but at a deeper level in terms of how do we feel about this church? How do we feel about the others in this church? It's actually, eventually it will split apart if they can't figure out how to move from multicultural to intercultural. And the people that will help them do that are actually their young people. Because their young people transcend those different cultures. And as a matter of fact, and this is really, we're probably going to run out of time, so I want to kind of just zero in on this for a minute. I think what's happening in our cities in Europe, not everywhere in Europe, because it's not happening in the rural areas, but in our cities in Europe, what's happening is that there's a new kind of culture developing amongst our young people. And it's actually an intercultural culture that's developing. It's different than any of the cultures that these young people come from. It's a new kind of culture. Now here's the challenge. Can we make that new kind of culture a Christian culture? What a blessing that would be for Europe. You know, when Europe first emerged, it was composed of different tribes. And the different tribes had different cultures and different beliefs and different customs and different everything, different languages. The gospel brought a single culture to Europe. It's an amazing thing. We have a European culture, and it was the gospel that caused that European culture to arise. Otherwise, we would simply be separate tribes. Could we do the same again with the new generation of youth? Could we produce a new intercultural culture that's influenced so deeply by the gospel that these kinds of things happen, that welcome rather than rejection? We want to send people home. No, we don't want to send them home. We want to bring them here to the gospel. Generosity. You're people in need, and therefore we try and meet your need.
You are Scottish, aren't you? Some Scottish guys say it's nothing wrong with being
I've got English parents. The place where we exhibit welcome and generosity is often around table, isn't it? Because one of the great multicultural things that can eventually become intercultural is how we bring our cultures to the table and learn to live with difference. So I guess that's my challenge to the church at this time, is quite simply, how do we work with our young people who have grown up with different cultures to begin to impregnate in them, in their multicultural experience, some deep gospel values that will shape the way in which this culture is going to develop. There's so much more we could say about this subject. It's just a massive, massive subject. And, you know, I'm working with my students all the time to try and address this question. How can they be successful, initially cross-cultural planters, and how can they eventually create multicultural, but hopefully eventually intercultural churches? It's a very exciting time. My big regret is this. Next birthday, I'm 70. I just wish I was 20. Because I think this next few years are going to be incredibly exciting. And I kind of envy my young students who are beginning on this journey. I think they've got a fantastic opportunity ahead of them. And it's an open field. It's a receptive field. And I just they'll have to be my legacy. But I wish I could be doing it myself, actually, because it's such an exciting time to be a Christian leader.